Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode on sustainability in space. My name is Nishan and from the Exponential Academy, and I'm
And
like, go ahead.
we always trip over this. And I'm Miki Sode. How are you doing? Thanks for
Fant-
joining us.
Fantastic. And we're delighted to be joined today by a very special guest. Our guest is Dr. Abhi Tripathi, who's the Director of Mission Operations at UC Berkeley Space Science Lab. He's had a very prestigious and high-profile career working at the forefront of many aspects of space exploration. Prior to his role with UC Berkeley, where they currently operate various satellites and space missions, he spent 10 years at SpaceX in a very senior position as mission director for various operations, as well as the chief engineer for flight reliability for some of the critical aircraft like the Dragon and the Crew Demo 1 and Demo 2 missions. Prior to that, he spent 10 years at NASA working on long-term planning for the Moon and Mars campaign. He holds degrees in aerospace engineering from University of Michigan and University of Colorado, and a PhD in geology and micropaleontology from UCLA. So with that, let me welcome Abhi to our podcast. Abhi, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Fantastic. Miki, I think you had some questions for Abhi.
Yeah. So as your brief bio and path, but I have to ask you, like, how's your journey from doing the geology and micropaleontology to SpaceX, and now UC Berkeley help Space Sciences Lab help overseeing the mission operations? How's that connect?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, after I got my degrees in aerospace engineering, I really wanted to look for life on other planets. So I went and got my PhD. After my PhD, I went to work for NASA for a couple more years before going to SpaceX. And the honest answer is I've barely used my PhD at all. I'd hope to be an astronaut, and maybe I will someday still be. And if I'm really lucky, I might still get to go to Mars someday when I'm maybe a little bit older. But the truth is I haven't used much of my PhD. Now, that being said, you asked a really good question. Even though I haven't explicitly used my PhD in terms of looking at fossils, I work at the Space Sciences Lab, where I'm surrounded by principal investigators for NASA missions that are all scientists. And me being trained as an engineer, working with them, I completely understand their language. I understand their thought process. Oftentimes, engineers get very frustrated by scientists because they speak very different languages. And I like to think I'm able to bridge that gap pretty effectively. So, even though I don't explicitly use what I learned in my PhD, it definitely does come in handy in my job even now.
Yeah, I totally resonate with you that I did have science background as well as an engineering background. So that translation is very important, actually. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting. One of the big themes we'll probably talk about today is kind of this cross-cultural understanding of different domains, and really, do they understand whether it's engineers to scientists, or, as we're going to talk about in a moment, policymakers to the private sector. Yeah, and that takes us a little bit to, I guess, the space economy, because over your career, I imagine you've seen a world where the industry was dominated by primarily state-funded organizations to the growth of private sector, and you've worked at the forefront of one of the most interesting, exciting, and largest private space enterprise. I think we've all seen the reuse of the Starship and the catching. So incredibly impressive feats of engineering that took place. But what we imagine is that we're at just the very start of this journey into the space economy. I mean, how do you see the space economy evolving? Right now, it's primarily funded by venture capitalists, philanthropists, large government organizations, primarily the defense industry. But I imagine as the space industry takes off, as we start to look at different horizons like private space stations, lunar bases or habitats on Mars, we will need institutional investors and other forms of capital to come in to really grow and expand the space economy.
Yeah, I think, if you look at the history of high-tech innovation, you really see that for the first stage, however long that stage is, the business case isn't really there. Oftentimes, it is completely a government case. And I think you're seeing the same thing in the space industry, to be quite frank. I think right now, the startups I'm seeing, one of my other jobs that I do, it's not a job, rather as a volunteer, is I'm the chair of the Air and Space track for the Berkeley Skydeck Accelerator. And the startups I'm seeing and the advice I'm giving them is, it's good if you have a product that, one day think will be amazing on the moon, like a rover or something. But you're not going to survive as a business unless you have near-term cash flow. And so you have to think of commercial opportunities, and you also have to think of military opportunities. And I think, especially in the year 2025, a good majority of the companies that are trying to get started in the commercial market for aerospace are going straight for military funding. And they're going to need that until there's a robust enough business case. You mentioned commercial LEO destinations. I'm not convinced right now that there is a business case for commercial LEO destinations. I'm of the, maybe handful of companies trying. I think only one right now is making what I would consider pretty good progress. And partially that's because they have an extremely wealthy backer that doesn't need investment money. The other ones I think are all struggling a bit. So I think, it's my opinion is that you kind of have to get over a little bit of that ick factor and realize that U.S. government and military funding is really what's going to be the way to get your business off the ground for, I would say, about the next 5 years. The lone example that doesn't fall into that category is SpaceX with its Starlink constellation going after the commercial market. However, even that product is being heavily paid for by government, who is equally interested in having their own version of Starlink, a private military version of Starlink, and that is a non-trivial source of cash flow.
Interesting. So yeah, government as a funder as well as a key customer. So yeah, clearly that's going to be an important segment. And we see that in many industries as well, where government is an anchor. But beyond those 5 years, because 5 years will just fly by, especially when you look at an industry. Do you have a mental model? Have you seen other mental models on how the private sector can get involved and move away from just a dependence on public funding?
There is no model. Like, there's only a few lone path breakers that are figuring it out. Again, Starlink figured it out, right? They figured out where others had tried the same idea for decades and failed, most notably Iridium, and they figured out how to make it economically work. So there are other people trying to figure out how to economically make it work. Another good example that I think is gaining traction and is an idea that I actually think will eventually be a very good commercial product. There are several companies working on small modular nuclear reactors. Now, a lot of these companies have aspirations. Well, this is how you would power a settlement on the moon or a settlement on Mars. So they believe in that, and that's their vision. But they also know that these small modular nuclear reactors might pay dividends much sooner on Earth. So the most viable commercial ideas I'm seeing are people that have a vision, an ultimately off-Earth vision, but they have the practicality to understand that they need a near-term, immediately impact people on Earth vertical in order to close their business case.
Interesting. So the pathway to commercialization or diversification away from the public sector is by having kind of real-world Earth-based commercial operations that can then easily scale into space. I mean, and linked to that, are there risks around coordination? We see this in the maritime industry, for example, where something which started like the UN Law of the Sea has evolved to various competing uses of whether it's offshore oil and gas, wind farms, areas of special protection for whale breeding grounds, to shipping lanes, for example. It's right now a real a mishmash of regulations and operations. And with the Arctic and Antarctic, there tries to be much cleaner forms of regulation on whether it's a model based on exploitation in the Arctic or preservation in Antarctica. I imagine it's going to be the same in the space industry, that you would not wish for operations to clash with future uses of space. For example, space debris, risks in terms of ownership of certain parts of the moon or areas of high value resources, for example. Do you see there being a need for coordination for space operation, or do you think it's just too early right now. It's the Wild West. Let 1,000 rockets bloom.
I think you hit the nail on the head, because I was about to use the railroad as an example. In the early days of the Transcontinental Railroad, there was not a ton of regulations, and there's an important reason for that. I'm a firm believer that when you have a new industry, you have to allow a learning period, and the learning period cannot just involve learning by a single company. It needs to be learning by multiple companies, that you start to have a body of evidence of, okay, this company tried this and it failed. We should take note. There might be a regulation needed there, future. This other company tried this and it succeeded. Until you have a body of evidence, all you're gonna do is you're gonna create really, really bad regulations, right? So I think the FAA has recognized this with commercial spaceflight, where Congress and the FAA keep extending what they call the learning period of commercial spaceflight, not imposing regulations from the government on any of these commercial providers, because they're realizing that so far you really only have one or two commercial providers that has enough of a body of evidence to actually inform smart regulations. So I think what I'm seeing right now in the space sector, when you talk about space sustainability or debris, is I think you're seeing SpaceX and other satellite operators that have more than a couple of satellites collecting good data. They're making mitigations on their own. They're sharing the mitigations that they're making. They're going to, science conferences, for example. If I'm talking about astronomers that might be mad that there's a lot of satellites getting in the way of their ability to do astronomy, well, SpaceX is going to astronomy conferences and explaining the mitigations they're doing. There are also other efforts I've heard that are government to government interactions going on right now to provide clean channels of communication between the satellites of one nation and another nation. So I think a lot of things are organically happening, and I think those will eventually help inform a set of good regulations. The key is, if you try to write good regulations too early, they will not be good regulations. They will be bad regulations, and they will, choke off innovation.
Right. So in this current state of the space commercialization, and then we did touch on a little bit of path to commercialization, and I think learning from whether ocean or the railroad and past innovation and how the industry took off and all of that stuff, it's sure we need out for learning period, but there are things that we can start to place in terms of like the bare minimum regulation, so that we don't shoot down each other's satellites and whatnot. What kind of frameworks that can be already be in place, or like where might be a sort of baseline the government or commercial entities and hopefully wide international community can use as a starting point?
Yeah, I mean, I think the starting point has to be government to government, military to military. So, for example, if Russia launches a rocket and they're trying to deploy some satellites, and the satellites don't deploy properly, they maybe the second stage of the rocket fails. On a radar, you might see all of a sudden a rocket with multiple things coming off of it. Okay, and that could be mistaken for, oh my gosh, is that a warhead with or is that a rocket weapon with multiple warheads coming off, right? So there already is infrastructure in place for the militaries of the spacefaring nations to talk to each other and warn each other about any such misunderstandings. So I think the basis for that already exists. Likewise, if there's a NASA satellite and it looks like it's going to have a conjunction with what the government believes might be a Chinese satellite, the government can call each other. Now, how much cooperation there might be between, depending on who the two state actors are, might be high cooperation or low cooperation, but the framework exists, okay? If you take it a step forward, if you look at SpaceX, on their website, they've already released an API that allows you as a satellite operator to use their API to figure out where all their Starlinks are, to help build automation in your own system to avoid Starlinks, to do maneuvers, or to know that Starlink will avoid you, which is what they tend to do. If I'm a satellite, this has happened to me before as a Berkeley operator. If I'm a satellite, I need to know which one of us is going to move before we collide. And SpaceX has already revealed, hey, this is what we do. We are going to be the ones to move. We know where all satellites are. We know where other satellites are through common databases. So I think, people have already taken actions and laid down a framework. But at the end of the day, I think you really need government to government cooperation between non-friendly nations before you can further a more holistic approach to regulations.
Interesting. So there's probably like a multi-layered approach to this. At the base layer, you talk about communication. At least, even without regulation, you've got the equivalent of a phone call and a point person that can be picked up. There's probably some elements of training. What is the training to make sure you're a skilled operator, to know some of those, know that some of these resources exist? There's probably something around culture and norms about operating space. And then you get to that regulatory stage.
Exactly. You got it.
Penalties and punishments and fines, whatever it's going to be.
Right? If you think about it, it's in everyone's best. It's in every individual operator's best interest to not have their satellites collide. Everyone's got the carrot right there, right? So you have to wonder how big of a stick do I need and how soon, if they already have a very important carrot. If their satellite's out of commission, forget about the debris for a second. Forget about Kessler. They're going to lose money. They're going to lose capability. They don't want to collide, right? So I think they're already motivated to not collide. So I think it's important for governments to help push that already natural inclination further and help give all those parties the tools, whether they be automation tools, whether they be simply a red phone, to talk to each other. It's good to keep encouraging all that type of behavior.
And I think what is interesting, because at the heart of that debate is the set of values, right? Do we have a common set of values, a common vision for what we want to use space for? And we saw that in December, you had put out quite a bold statement on X, formerly Twitter, about a vision for NASA, which was interesting, because you said, well, actually, NASA should much more explicitly, rather than being a science research organization, have a sole focus of being helping humanity to become a multi-planetary species, right? With regional centers of research, and that should be the focus of NASA with that R&D, with that operation. Other private operators, other nations may disagree with that, and even with that becoming a multi-planetary species, there are going to be questions about, if I have human habitats in different parts of the solar system, the moon, Mars, am I allowed to extract from that? Am I allowed to preserve? Am I allowed to share that with other nation states, for example, or other private operators? How do you see that value system evolving? Do you think there is a broad consensus that's the value system around the world that a lot of people agree with, that humanity should be a multi-planetary?
So I think there's multiple things. I think people need to have consensus around shared space, which is there's really a lot of condemnation around any country that does what's called an ASAT test, an anti-satellite test, because those tests create debris. They create shrapnel in all sorts of orbits. China has done ASAT tests. I think India has. Other nations immediately come out and condemn, because that is a very irresponsible way. And it's getting to your point, Nishan, it's where maybe the norms and the policies of the governments do not match. If you are a nation that feels threatened by another one, you may have less qualms about doing an anti-satellite test to show how strong of a nation you are, right? Where as a nation that feels very comfortable, it knows how to do, anti-satellite maneuvers, doesn't need to do that. So I think there's a mismatch there. Now, to me, that's a different question than extracting resources on the moon or Mars, to which I would say, I don't really care what anyone else thinks. If you are able to get to the moon or Mars, you're certainly not going to hurt the moon or Mars. There's certainly no way to pollute the moon or Mars. They're completely dead bodies. And so to me, I would just say, I don't really care what anyone else thinks, and you go do what you got to do.
So that's interesting, provocative in itself. And again, you have a deep set of experience on this and more knowledge than most. But what happens when we find scarce resources like water, for example, in certain craters in certain parts of the moon that is very restrictive and very valuable in that area. I mean, what bodies would exist to govern that, for example?
Nobody should exist. It should be, if you get there, if you are able to get there, and very few people will, then you should have at it and go for it. I don't think anyone should ever regulate that until we have planetary-wide governments, like in some science fiction novels, like the Expanse series, where I don't know if you guys ever watched the show Expanse, but it's the Earth against the Belters against Mars. I mean, that's like maybe 100 years or more in the future, if ever. So right now, I mean, if only one nation has the ability to go, I don't know, mine water on the moon, power to them. I don't think there should be any regulations.
So first come, first serve. The first nation to get
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a very hard thing. It's extremely capital intensive. Maybe one or two nations might be able to pull it off in the next 20 or 30 years. And the moon is huge compared to whatever effort those one or two nations can mount in the next 100 years. So I think any regulations are unnecessary.
So to draw from another science fiction genre for all mankind, where there was that kind of habit, what happens when you get to risky operators? A risky private sector operator go first, takes risks by drilling in an unsafe environment, and the nation states in that example, I believe it was Russia and the US, had to hold back or bail out the private enterprise. I mean, do you not think that this will start to engender certain risky behaviors in
I hope it does. I mean, lots of people died coming to the new world. Lots of people are going to die when we try to put settlements on the moon or Mars. I mean, that should be obvious to anybody commercially backing a venture to the moon or Mars, that people are going to die. But people have died throughout the history of the world when we explore. So I definitely don't think regulations are needed. I mean, how heavily was, Magellan or Columbus regulated when they went to discover the new world? Probably not at all. And I don't think anything should be any different for the moon or Mars.
Interesting. Interesting. And so go ahead, Miki.
No, it's okay. I had a thought, but I already covered that, so it's okay. Yeah.
So effectively, it's a model of survival of the fittest, survival of kind of the first come, first serve. And in that model, you're effectively saying that those with access to the deepest pocket, just like the Magellan example, or just like the original explorers, your first, up Everest, the first to discover, Shackleton and Anderson to the Antarctica and to the North Pole. Those who have access to the National Geographic Society's equivalent of the past, and deep philanthropists and venture backers, private capital in many cases, will likely be the winners. And so, higher rewards.
I mean, that's consistent with history. It's not, you're risking a ton. I mean, nations have gone, like, I think the Spanish Empire crumbled, because they tried to explore too much, right? And that's what happened. Other nations that were able to succeed did so at great risk to the possibility that their nation or their empire or whatever would collapse. So if you're willing to bet your private fortune, or if you're willing to bet your national existence to some venture, I mean, that's a risk that deserves a reward, in my opinion. So I think, look at the counterexample. Do we wait until all nations are able to have a rocket or a spacecraft that can go to the moon? I mean, there's 100 and almost 200 nations on Earth. Where do you draw the line at what's equitable? I don't think that makes sense. I think if you can go there and get to the moon or get to Mars, then you should be rewarded for your great risk.
So it almost sounds as if there are different horizons of the space economy that will have to be regulated in different ways, right? You've got near Earth, low Earth orbit. There are risks, as we've started now to do shuttle ISS, 25, 30 years of human occupation there. We now know things like Kessler effect, the need to have satellites that can navigate themselves. We know less about private stations. We know less about occupation, long-term occupation on the moon and the Mars. And so maybe there's more, if there was a spectrum of communication, culture, norms, regulation, a lot more around low Earth orbit. right?
Yeah,
Maybe.
because low Earth orbit, it's going back to what we said earlier, it's a more mature market. There's a lot of knowledge. People have operated in this space. They have good lessons learned, technical lessons learned, cultural lessons learned that can go to help inform good regulations, good rules, good norms. Whereas, talking about the moon or Mars, there's no experience whatsoever. You need people to be able to get there to form experience, to begin to lay the groundwork for some future set of norms or rules.
Yeah. But time to yes, there are frameworks already, but maybe there are more coordinations and setting standards and norms to be done to encourage more commercial activities, especially in LEO, with private sector as well as international players. And if I think that is already starting, but you were saying like it's organic. I feel like it's a time to have more concerted effort for that. But like, who should lead the way? It is a group effort, but then it would be helpful to have somebody to kind of guide the way and go towards a shared vision, right?
See, I don't think anyone from outside the companies can guide the way, because by definition, the people from outside the companies and in the government know way, way less than the people inside the companies, right? So I think there's already an organic effort. Again, SpaceX with Starlink, who has the most experience, has already said, here's what we're doing to mitigate reflection, to make lives easier for astronomers. Here's what we're doing to make sure we don't leave debris up in space. We fly our spacecraft at very low orbits, so they degrade fast at end of life, and we have extra propellant to make sure we can deorbit them. They're saying everything they're doing to be good stewards, right?
I see.
And they're putting the playbook out there. So you want to make sure that other people see the playbook and are organically accepting the playbook. And if they're not, then you start raising a stink as to, hey, they've already shown you how to make your satellite less bright. Why aren't you doing any of this, right? And the answer might be a legitimate answer, and that answer might lead to a better understanding to eventually write regulations. I do think, however, in the case that I said, where it's where conversations need to occur between commercial companies or a commercial company and a government, where there's an adversarial relationship. For example, if I have a commercial US satellite and an unknown suspected Chinese military satellite, and I'm worried about a collision there, at that point, the commercial company is not powerful enough, is not connected enough, and frankly might be illegal for them to talk to the potential Chinese entity. You need the government to step in and help facilitate those lines of communication. So I think the best thing the government could do right now is to establish clear lines of communications such that you can, pick up the red phone and talk between commercial companies and governments, commercial companies in one country, commercial companies in another, to make sure that they are doing enough to lay that groundwork down, because that will be the most important part of any future regulations.
Interesting.
And that works today when we have good corporate actors, those with the equivalent of the moral compass and trust us with it. But at some stage, it's inevitable. Just like I'm sure tobacco, when it came through, they came in with the well-intentioned, and they realized big tobacco was big tobacco. It was causing cancer, things like that. Big oil was big oil. It was causing huge, a climate change, and had at some stage big space will become big space, and the incumbents may prefer regulation and norms that benefit the incumbents and not newcomers that may try to so how do we think about that? There are examples with the governance of the internet, for example, with ICANN, public-private partnership. We can start to look at those frameworks. Are there models like that you can see eventually evolving?
I think so. I think the key is still collecting more information, because right now it's not clear to me who succeeds at all beyond SpaceX, right? You have Kuiper, who've been promising to launch for a long time, and I think they're going to lose part of their spectrum unless they get some 200 or 600 satellites up by 2026, which is, I'm not sure if it will happen or not. So before I worry about hey, what if the actors and the incumbents squash the other people? I have to figure out who is going to be another actor, because right now I only see one that's really making it. And you haven't seen anything in terms of bad intentions, but I think you should definitely err on the side of less regulations if you're worried that the incumbent is going to use regulations to stamp out the competition while the competition is still in its infancy. That's even more of an argument for not having regulations until we get more evidence of how did things unfold for each of these other companies. I think once you have, I don't know, several actors that are all doing well, now's the time you come together with the lessons learned from each to make sure that we're not creating monopolies, that we're creating a set of rules or norms that other people have, through evidence, can actually work within to bring a product to market.
Excellent. Well, Abhi, we're coming to the time that we had for this episode. I mean, this is a fascinating conversation. I feel we could talk for a long time. I mean, some of the takeaways I got from this discussion was, number one, we need to be grounded. If we're going to look at the frontiers of the space economy, be grounded on Earth first. Have some fundamentals, good business fundamentals.
Absolutely.
Going forwards. I think that's one takeaway. And the second is this thing about, or this anchor and shared experiences. Right? So those are language, kind of communication, norms, culture. Once we have these shared experiences, that's going to form the basis for whatever sort of governance systems. I'm not using the word regulations, but governance systems to ensure that we have an orderly development of space. And the third is your point about kind of how is the space sector going to eventually diversify it? And you're saying it's just too early. We don't know. There's so many unknowns on where that new capital, what that new venture, how that's going to materialize and evolve. And that in itself is fascinating. But someone with your deep experience does not know. It just shows, how much we are still to learn about this evolving field.
Yeah, absolutely. The capital requirements are enormous, right? So it's hard to find even venture capitals. Most venture capitalists don't have the pockets or the risk appetite. So I agree with everything you said. It's very early, and we'll see how it unfolds.
Well, Abhi, from Mickey and I, thank you very much. And we hope you can join us on a future podcast as well to share your insights.
Absolutely. It was great chatting with you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.